This summer, we're bringing two guest speakers from England for our annual conference, the Reverend John Churcher and the Reverend Mo Wills. Together, we're going to try to take an in-depth look at the historical evolution of what people have meant when they say the word God. We're using the nearly encyclopedic work of Karen Armstrong's History of God and Case for God in our preparations. But the final point is not just to look back at what others have meant in the past, but to try to find a way to meaningfully articulate what it is that we mean now. We in the progressive movement, what do we really think of as the nature, the character, the meaning of God? Now, those of you who are watching online, let me tell you that registration for our event here on August 5th and 7th is nominal, $20. The three of us will give an abbreviated presentation on Monday evening, August the 8th, at the Emmanuel United Church of Christ in Ferguson, Missouri. And then the three of us travel to Columbia, South Carolina, where we will repeat the entire weekend conference at the Unitarian Universalist Church on August 12th and 14th. So geographically, we're covering at least that much territory if you want to come and be a part of that at the place closest to you. Now, I wrote a chapter in my 2014 book, Progressive Faith and Practice, on this topic, but I have been repeatedly made aware that my brief chapter doesn't really do more than open the theological door without providing very many satisfactory conclusions. Shortly after we announced that this conference was going to happen, our good friend Bishop John Shelby Spong started publishing a series of essays in which he is publicly grappling with this exact same topic. I called him and asked if this was the material he plans to use at the conference we're doing together in Sarasota, Florida in 2 weeks, and he said, no, this is material he is developing for his 2017 lecture tour. If you can believe that an 85-year-old retired bishop is currently writing his material for his 2017 lecture tour, all of us who are much younger and much less productive than Bishop Spong should just take a moment to let that sink in. So I'm trying to work out my August material here in January, and that's about as far ahead as I've ever prepared for anything. I want to try something different today, in that sermons are usually built to a conclusion. I want to start today with the conclusion because we all know where we're headed. I will even give it to you in a Bible verse, 1 John 4, verse 8, the last part of that verse. God is love. And for good measure, because Scripture is not enough for a lot of us, let me quote the great Dane himself, Søren Kierkegaard. This is all that I've known for certain, that God is love. Even if I've been mistaken on this or that point, God is, nevertheless, love. Now, here in this church, we've often used the Ziggy Marley song in our services that announces, "Love is my religion," and we've done the Beatles hit, "All you need is love." So that's my premise. That's my conclusion, my ultimate point. And you might think, why is it going to take you three people an entire weekend to say that? But the fact that poets, musicians, philosophers, and saints have been saying this for thousands of years makes it inescapable that understanding what that means is evidently darn near impossible. Of course, much of the problem resides in the fact that the word love is so overworked. We love Adele's new album. I love sushi. I love to go scuba diving. And often even when we say, I love you to another person, we say that with such a large I and such a small you that there's really nothing remotely holy about it. In saying that God is love, we are, or at least most of us are, starting to remove from our understanding of God the more primitive view of God as a person or as three persons. or if you're a Hindu, lots of persons. Most of traditional religion has at least been expressed in terms of supernatural theism. God as a human, or as one 4th century philosopher liked to say, that if horses had gods, they would look like horses. We have tended to project our experience of the divine into a person. When I was a young grad student, there was a huge battle raging in seminaries about referring to God as Father or any male pronoun. Masculine references had been the rule, but when you think about what would make a person male as opposed to being female, that boils down to certain body parts, and that is a real Sunday school conversation showstopper. No one that I have ever known wanted to defend the idea of God having a body or being in any particular place in the way that ancients believed that their gods looked like humans and lived either on top of mountains or in kingdoms that resided in the clouds above the earth. But even when you let go of believing in an imaginary friend who lives in the clouds, it's still difficult to give up the notion of God as a person. A person who might, if you ask often enough, favor the Broncos over the Panthers, or the armies of the USA over ISIS. You would not get trapped in a theological argument over whether God prefers blue over green or Chinese food over Mexican food, but it's harder to give up on the idea that God is somehow still the causative agent in human history that we can somehow influence. Much has been made over the implied theology that we see in sci-fi movies, especially in Star Wars, where people talk about the Force. In the very first movie, Obi-Wan Kenobi explains to Luke, the Force is what gives a Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together. Now, there is a dualism in the dark and light sides of the Force in Star Wars, a good and evil side. Nerds will then burn the midnight oil, arguing whether George Lucas was influenced by Zoroastrianism or Taoism or Buddhism. It's an interesting thought, but of course Lucas doesn't remain consistent with whatever religious influences he may have had to clone into his movies. The Force quickly becomes little more than an energy drink between good and evil guys fighting with lightsabers, and whatever meaningful or helpful non-theistic conception of God there may have been originally becomes silly pretty fast. But I don't fault Lucas for that. It's not an easy concept to talk about meaningfully. The words force or energy may have roles to play in how we talk about God as love and not as a person who's willing to place a bet in the Super Bowl. In my chapter in Progressive Faith and Practice, in which I talk about this, I employ the phrase that I come back to now and will again and again, that any time you try to get specific about talking about who or what God is, anytime you try to take the mystery and make it a concrete explanation, that language starts to become like nailing smoke to a wall. As much as it pains those of us who want to be able to explain everything, the biggest part of this issue is forever shrouded in mystery. Back before he became an absolute avowed atheist and wouldn't give up any sense of the divine, Bill Maher used to say, I believe that God exists, but I don't believe anyone on earth knows as much about God as my dog knows about how I balance my checkbook. That the conception that we would like to be able to explain is so far beyond human conception that you just start to sound silly as soon as you try to get too specific about it. Albert Einstein is often referred to as having been an atheist, but it's important to note that Albert Einstein never described himself that way. It's just that what he did believe was so nuanced, so obscure, that to a traditional Christian, it sounded like atheism. He wrote, "We are in the position of a little child entering a huge library filled with books in many different languages, the child knows that someone must have written those books, but it does not know how. It does not understand the languages in which they are written. The child dimly suspects a mysterious order in the arrangement of the books, but doesn't know what it is. That, it seems to me, is the attitude of even the most intelligent human being towards God. We see a universe marvelously arranged and obeying certain laws, but only dimly understand the laws. Our limited minds cannot grasp the mysterious force that moves the constellations. Einstein concludes, there remains something subtle, intangible, and inexplicable. Veneration for this force beyond anything that we can comprehend is my religion. Now, exactly here is the point where Buddhist monks start to sound like astrophysicists and scientists start to sound like religious mystics. Both of them insist that at the core of all existence is the inescapable truth that we are all connected. We're all connected to each other biologically. We are connected even to the rocks and grass and trees chemically, and to the rest of the universe atomically. That mystery, that connection, that force or energy, we sometimes sense as awe, what Martin Buber called the I and thou experience, that seems to affect us at our deepest core. All of the world's religions are an attempt at describing that experience that all of us have had, that sense of mystery and awe and wonder, our sense that somehow we are not separate from everyone else in the rest of the universe, but that we are all connected. And so religions have tried to describe this, to codify it, to teach it in holy scriptures through rituals and hymns and art and architecture. But you have to say, they never get it right. Almost an exhaustion, prophets, saints, sages, scientists, and philosophers finally boil it down to saying, it's love. It's love. Not a person, not a thing, but somehow that mysterious force of love. It is my loving others. It is in that experience of honoring the connection, loving someone, forgiving someone, accepting someone. That is the only path we have to experience the divine. That is our only true worship, our real sacrament, and frankly, the only scripture we ever need. The Dalai Lama said, our only purpose in life is to love one another. And he added, if you can't do that, try not to hurt anyone. I mean, it's the physician's oath, don't do any harm. But the Dalai Lama says the only real reason you exist, don't look for any meaning beyond it, you are to be loving. That is your reason to exist. And if you just can't organize your life enough to be loving, try not to mess up other people's lives. Try not to hurt them. Which is in a way to acknowledge that there is a dark side of the force. There is an opposite to loving. And the Zoroastrians may not have been entirely wrong in saying that the two sides of the force are about equal power. I mean, the Zoroastrians invented a religion that pretty well describes the way the world looks like it works, that it does seem like good and evil are pitched in a constant battle over which there's no succeeding. There is the love that brings us together, that creates not only marriages, but friendships, and creates community and makes civilization possible. And there is the darkness of narcissism and greed and self-righteousness that divides us, that pulls us apart, that defeats civilization, that destroys peace, that alienates lovers and ends friendships and makes community impossible. Far too often, the religious impulses that should help us to find a spiritual path into that loving connection with others has become the dark and dividing force that really makes spirituality nearly impossible. I mean, it's sad to have to acknowledge how much of formal religions, organized religions, actually militate against the essence of connectedness and love. Bishop Spong has called for a new reformation, one that allows us to strip away the magic and superstition to reveal a kind of spirituality that is rooted in reality and not based on myth and imagination. And I think that we are seeing it happen in important ways, subtle but important ways. In our never-ending presidential campaign, we see nearly every candidate trying to polish their religious bona fides. Donald Trump was seen a couple of weeks ago in a Presbyterian church, and he's now carrying a family Bible to events in Iowa, even though he still doesn't know how to say the names of the books of the New Testament, and clearly is a stranger to everything that happens inside the four walls of the Presbyterian churches he claims to be a member of. Attack ads have been calling out other candidates for pretending to be right-wing evangelicals when in fact they neither attend nor support the churches that they claim to belong to. But for the first time in modern memory, we have a political candidate this year who claims no affiliation with organized religion. Now, I want you to forgive me. I don't want to sound like this is a stump speech, because it's no secret that I personally really like Bernie Sanders. But a lot of perfectly sane, intelligent, and well-meaning people support other candidates or other candidate. And it may be a narrow field, but perfectly intelligent, sane, and sincere people can disagree. I had been saying that if Bernie were elected, that he would be America's first Jewish president. But when he has recently been pressed on this issue, even though he grew up Jewish, he was bar mitzvahed, he went to Hebrew school, and even lived for a time in a kibbutz in Israel. But now he says that he is not actively involved in any organized religion. And I don't know if anyone since Jefferson has said that in a presidential campaign. What he said was, I think everyone believes in God in their own ways. To me, it means that all of us are connected. All of life is connected, and that we are all tied together, which is precisely what I've been trying to say. The unique thing for me is that a popular presidential candidate can publicly say that he not only doesn't go to church, but he just doesn't practice any organized religion, and the country doesn't come to a sudden screeching halt. What he is saying is no longer offensive to us. It's not foreign to our ears. And truth be told, it's probably what most of the other candidates and public figures actually believe. The only difference is that Bernie is now willing to say it. The facade of false ancient religions is being pulled back away from our society. The echoes of ancient religious teachings, married to the mystery and the wonder of modern science, leads us not to become atheists, but to acknowledge that while we believe in God, all we really know about God is our experience of awe and of love. And the only path to drawing near to God is by getting better at loving one another. This is both liberating and it is immensely challenging. Because once freed from the constraints of ancient creeds and religious manipulation, our first impulse is not to draw closer to one another, but to flee in a much more narcissistic endeavor. We still have a lot of work to do if we want to grow spiritually, and I hope we do. I know that I do, and I hope I'm not alone. I may be wrong about a lot of things through the years, but I'm not wrong about this. God is love. And the only way to know God is by loving one another.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.